Well, first of all, welcome to everyone on behalf of the New School, although you've already been actively engaged for a couple of hours. I hope the conference has been great. I want to thank Radhika Subramaniam for putting this together. It was delayed somewhat by a major urban issue that we're all facing these days, particularly since so many urban areas are low-lying. I think New York finally got a taste of what other parts of the world have been getting with Hurricane Sandy. Also, congratulations to Vinayak and all your collaborators on that book. It looks tremendous. It looks tremendous. And I think it's finally fitting. I mean, it's sort of fitting that today I've been running back and forth between various activities that all have a common theme, which is about design and urbanity. And you know, as most of the world is now urban, it's becoming only more important as people live in smaller concentrated spaces, is how they live. Design, we were just discussing infrastructure, such a big issue, just sort of the sewer pipes and the water supplies and all that kind of very important. But it's also, I think, also very important the functionality and aesthetics of the way the urban environment is, because it's our home now for just about everyone. And I think the New School really does pride itself on being revolving around creativity, innovation, and challenging the status quo, as well as being engaged with the world around. And I think for a long, long time, while we had scholars here from Europe and other places, we were fairly New York centric, New York City centric. And I think it's in the last 10 years or so we've really stretched out, whether it's been through our people in Parsons, through people in Milano, our international affairs program, people at Lang. People are realizing the urban issues are worldwide and they're common problems. Yes, they have local flavors, local variations, but it's a common set of problems. It's all about human needs and making human life better within what is now the dominant mode of living in urban environments. So I just think it's great that you're doing this. It's part of a lot of things going on here at the New School involving global urbanism. And I hope you'll, once you get out of this room, I hope you look around a little bit and welcome, for those of you from outside, welcome to the New School. So carry on. Thank you.
So I have the somewhat odd pleasure of introducing my interlocutor, Robert, and myself. And I'll go first, though I'm going to speak about Robert first. Robert Cowherd is Associate Professor of Architecture at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston. His latest publications are Notes on Post-Criticality Towards an Architecture of Reflexive Modernization, which appeared in the Delft School of Design Journal, Agency in Architecture, Reframing Criticality in Theory and Practice 4, and Constructing Discourse, Constructing Space, The Heterotopian Divide in Jakarta, in Heterotopia and the City. His open source model for village mapping and planning was instrumental in post-tsunami reconstruction in Aceh in 2005. I am the Director and Chief Curator of the Sheila Johnson Design Center at Parsons and Assistant Professor in the School of Art and Design, History and Theory. Previously, I was the Director of Cultural Programs at the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council and the founding Executive Director of Connect, an interdisciplinary art journal published by Arts International. My various curatorial projects have included Art in Odd Places Number, which is coming up in October, Art in Odd Places Sign in 2009, Art Environment Action, Living Concrete Carrot City, co-curated with Nevin Cohen, and Cities Art and Recovery, two-year international initiative focused on art and culture in the aftermath of catastrophe. I was last year at the San Francisco Art Institute, where I had a seed fund teaching fellowship in urban studies. So I'm taking off that hat. As you may have gathered, is this working fine? Okay. As you may have gathered from my bio, I've been several different things. I'm an anthropologist and a kind of cultural studies theorist by training. I've been a curator, a public art curator for many years, and my work in Asian cities or in cities in general basically spans Bombay, which was a kind of deeply anthropological project, and New York, which in many ways has been a kind of curatorial excavation of what it means to live in cities under crisis. So the way I'm going to structure the remarks this morning or this afternoon is to look at a series of prescriptions from the city of Bombay, Mumbai, I should say. These are prescriptions that come much more from struggling through ways of engaging cities, ways of representing cities, ways of thinking about places that come from a much more slant enterprise than sheer analytics, and that are concerned much more with what makes experiential sense of place. Prescription 1, prospect. There are no cityscapes in Bombay. Every promontory or high-rise view sends you half out to sea. Whether you look across from the heights of Malabar Hill caressing Marine Drive to the big business towers of Nariman Point, or from Worli past the minaret of Haji Ali Dargah, marooned at high tide, or to the Mahalakshmi Temple, most of what you see is the gentle sweep of the bay. The city does not look at itself, even through the barred windows of crowded commuter locals as they rattle past buildings pocked with the scars of monsoon, not as a landscape, and certainly not as an abstraction. Those eating the wind, Hawa Khana, as the expression goes, on the occasional seaside promenade, look, if they must, out to sea before they plunge back into the entrails of city streets, jostling, shoving, swept along. Hundreds of faces, hundreds of odors, hundreds of sounds. A poet of the city, also a doctor, Giv Patel, says thus: "Almost I tell myself, I embrace the people, revel in variety of eye, color, cheek, bone. Unwelcome guest, I may visit bodies, touch, close, cure, throw overboard, necessities of distance, plunge, splice, violate with needle, knife, and tongue, wreck all my bonds in them. At end of day, from under the flagpole, watch the city streaming by the side of my hands." Prescription 2, screen test. There are no long shots in Bombay, only the close-up. No sweeping panoramic pans or domestication of distance is available in the city. The prescription is derived from a product of its famed film industry, the billboard. Towering several tens of feet and ubiquitous, the enlarged heads and faces that dwarf buildings and roads and everywhere are perceived only in giant form provide a hint that the city images itself up close and personal. Salman Rushdie, whose pen has been trained by Bombay's sounds, refers to its language as garbage. Mumbai ki kachadapatti baatcheet, for those of you who understand the language, in which he puts it, a sentence could begin in one language, swoop through a second, even a third, and then swing back around to the first. The acronym for this, he says, is Hug Me. Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, Marathi, English. Hug Me. It's surely not an accident that this is a physical embrace. Prescription 3, contagion. V.S. Naipaul's matter-of-fact summary of this city was Bombay is a crowd. Dense and jostling against the skin, multiplicity is the lasting impression of the city. The numbers of this city are not the cool abstractions of mathematics, but electric, urban, mass, volatile numbers. They do not discipline urban babble into statistical syntax, but retain the potential to turn large and unruly. 20.5 million in 2012, 12.5 million in 1991. What would it mean to work with these numbers, to work with the crowd as the definition of the city, to take this as central to our understanding of urban experience? Prescription 4, whispers and mental life. Writing almost 3 decades after Zimmel's seminal work on the city, Freud chose Rome to think through another problem of the metropolis and mental life. If the eternal city was a psychical entity, not a settlement, might not its ruins and restorations tell us something about the ways in which memories remain as traces in the mind? But he was to balk before his analogy. because he realized that unlike the mind, to which nothing is lost, even if lost to consciousness, even in the most peaceful of cities, demolitions and destructions routinely obliterate earlier signs. He concluded, therefore, Freud, that is, that history could never be represented spatially, because space could never hold the multiple layers of history simultaneously. A single space could never have two contents. And so the master of the memory trace seems to be warning us that with demolitions, riots, even the renaming of the city, one Bombay, Mumbai, will be lost to us. Yet isn't his attention to the little slips and jokes that tumble through the lips of the unconscious that also guide us to mark the ways in which history leaks into the crowded spaces of the city? Rumor is a slipping back of history through the lips of the crowd. Rumor is eternally transformative and agile. It encrypts an array of psychic, emotional, and historical information which emerges under various guises and always appears strangely familiar. But it is not the role of story or rumor as catalyst or mobilizer that interests me. What the metaphor of contagion that rumor implies dramatically evokes, it seems to me, is the way in which fears and anxieties that are born by rumor settle on the skin. These are not only sensations of situations of danger, but also part of the daily experience of cities. The prickling of fear, the clammy hand, the heightened awareness of one's surroundings, all the sensory cues that unsettle the equilibrium of one's daily life, the sense of certainty of being out of control that is carried in this image. When the boundaries of one's body may be breached, fear is immediately tactile. The horror that lies at the heart of the image of contagion is that of millions of microscopic entities invading one's body. This is an image that comes to me from Canetti, Elias Canetti, with his massive work on crowds and power. Because Canetti says, it's only in the crowd that the fear of being touched is assuaged, because the crowd presses in on its members, rendering their physical and psychic distance negligible, so that they cease to fear its touch. An estrangement from the crowd can abruptly bring back a fear of unexpected or unknown touch that can mount to panic. So note this point. The crowd as the daily throng of the city is actually a place of refuge, of anonymity from authority. It is the distanciation from the crowd that evokes fear. This separation and the desire for security may then crystallize around other crowd images: invasion, contamination, conflagration. Medical histories. Lafra Hoenga, archive. Almost 100 years after the first Ganapati Mela, which is a festival that takes place in Bombay in September and is a site of both a great nationalist outpouring, a regionalist outpouring, as well as usually a stimulus for heavy violence. 100 years after the first Ganapati Mela, scripted by Tilak, was held in Bombay, and only a few months before the name of the city was to be knocked sideways into another, I was driving to the streets one early morning, and I remarked at the gold and glitter of the Ganapatis sparkling gently in the late moonlight. The immersion processions were to be that day. Lafra Hoenga, said the cab driver to me tersely, there will be trouble. The Shiv Sena party leader Bal Thackeray, recently dead, but at that time his wife Meena Tai had died, and he expected the crowds, the cab driver did, to be at militant fever pitch. With the recasting of the Shiv Sena local political party as the Hindutvavadi party, Shivaji as a martial, masculine Maratha Hindu hero had appeared on the scene, and such large ritual activities as the Ganpati festival had been a powerful means of mobilization. Space in Bombay, as anywhere else, is not an innocent theater of actions, but a powerfully performative actor implicated in the forms of zones of contestation. Embedded in the alleys, thoroughfares, localities, beaches, are strong spatial codes that are culturally constituted and enlisted at various historical conjunctures. That is, symbolic meaning retained by collective actions in these spaces, such as marches and processions, directs not only their enactment, but also their readings as territorial, protesting, celebratory, ceremonial, or a combination thereof. These codes function as an archive, imparting to street-level action a residue not only of politics, but also of poetics. They draw attention not only to the political meaning of collective public actions, but they also suggest the forms, parades, prayer meeting, processions that such actions should take. Prescription 5, commonplaces. It wasn't until I had left Bombay for several years and returned that I realized how odd but instructive the directions were that I received from someone I was to meet for the first time. When you take a bus, he said, get off before JJ Hospital. It was a sort of direction that appeared to provide a landmark but actually stopped at a nondescript wayside stall. Get off before you get to the place that you haven't been to as yet. The type of seeing that misses the monument by wandering off into a by-lane. It was also the type of instruction in which the city space could not be defamiliarized by mapping, but only constituted in sharing, and it was one among many other experiences that drove my attention to the commonplace. Now decried as trite and banal, commonplaces, we should remember, were for Aristotle the bedrock of daily life, those ways of articulating that underlie everyday interaction and are therefore invisible, even unthinking. They were common because necessary. As part of the larger perceptual world of the city, it is the habitual that provides an everyday understanding of the people and places of the city. It provides the cultural as well as sensuous framework for the type of irritable, familiar jostling of the city, the interactions on trains, bazaars, tea stalls, streets, those inimitably Bombay activities of loafing and time pass through posters, billboards, and cassettes that help construct a series of observations and attitudes through which people engage with the city. Prescription 6. I'm not the first to argue for an overthrow of the regime of the eye, the vantage point that allows one to survey the terrain and stroke the chin of retrospection. Daily life in the crowded modern metropolis, Walter Benjamin, many years before me, required new modes of perception. The shocks of city life required a form of engagement that was distracted, not contemplative, tactile and kinesthetic, not visual. This distracted mastery ultimately became a matter of habit, requiring neither focus nor attention. Habit, according to him, obliterated a sense of landscape, disallowing the ability to discern foreground and background that perspective, the perspective of seeing landscape, promotes. But this, what he called lost property of landscape in the city, might only disturb a single viewer or a small group of spectators desirous of control and contemplation. The vast majority on the streets who go about their daily business in habituated, unfocused, and peripherally attentive ways. The forms of tale-telling in which events are already harnessed, events such as Sandy, events such as the Bombay riots, are always already harnessed to the yoke of explanation, and places are only signposts on the crossroads of analysis, does not meet the challenges of representing urban experience. Taking the crowd as the interpretive paradigm for urban life in Bombay demands different metaphors of apprehension and different structures of translation that have hitherto been used for cities. Such a city cannot be seen as a stage or a street, as a display or a text to be read. It is not made legible by grids and maps, although undoubtedly maps do exist outlining the lean pincers of a once island city, because its contours are much too narrow to get lost in, except if one is lost in the crowds. It snakes northwards, it grows skywards, it floods from within. Bombay, I suggest, is not a city of verticality or horizontality, whose profound inequities can be captured in dramatic visual clarity. It eludes perspective, asking to be felt and inhabited closely and intimately. What will we know if we enter it blind? Thank you.
First of all, thank you, everyone. My name is Robert Cowherd, and it's a great honor to be here today. I want to thank especially Parsons and the New School and the organizers, Asim and Radhika, and for Vinayak for this wonderful adventure that started with a book and continues on. And I think that it's important to recognize that this is the third of 3 presentations that we have made in the last week. And so this presentation will be different from the last 2, partially under because of the circumstances, but also partially because of the influence of Radhika's work, which I have been challenged to kind of juxtapose my own work with. And thus I start with this image that gets to an issue that I had seen as being a separate issue to a certain extent, and that is the operation of social forces in the space that is framed by architecture and the streets of our environments. And this has led me to look at photographers, and it has led me to look at the work of anthropologists, specifically Pierre Bourdieu. I also want to refer to the possible trajectories of this work that we are collectively engaged in. I think it's quite instructive that a network, an international network that is so far only manifested in North America, has begun in a very like-minded way to challenge academia and practice to become more relevant to the experience of everyday life and the struggles of communities on the streets in the different cities around the world, not just in Asia. So I start with this work of Pierre Bourdieu that came directly out of his field work in North Africa, in which the women of the village, it was their task to gather water. But because it is a Muslim society, it was important for them not to be seen in public space. And so a secondary network developed in the village of Kabylia. And Pierre Bourdieu came away from this experience with his idea of the habitus, which is not the habitat in and of itself, but it is the mental structures that are reinforced by the physical structures. And so this relates, I hope, directly to Radhika's idea of the habit, that our habits that we are precognitive and unconscious structure our behaviors and meanings in space. And so like the pre-visual and the precognitive, the habitus is an extremely useful concept for understanding how our places and their physical spatial structures interplay with power, identity, politics, economics, etc. And to this, I also want to refer to the photography of Iwan Ban, who has broken two significant taboos in architectural practice and its representation. He has broken with the taboo of focusing on the idealized architectural object by swinging back his camera and letting the spatial frame of the city frame the architecture. His second taboo is to be more influenced by portrait photographers than the prior generations of architectural photographers. And so he is interested in photographing people. But in his case, he is hired by the most famous architects in the world to photograph people in their spaces. And so these two taboos are quite interesting in terms of this. So the two reference points are the anthropological work of Pierre Bourdieu, especially his idea of habitus, and the world of architectural photography as it might be leading to other changes. When I arrived in Central Java, I was a quite naive recent graduate of an architecture school. I saw the vertical city of Jakarta. I saw the horizontal city of the cities of Indonesia, and full of life. I also saw the traditions of the bazaar, where people mix, undermined by an apartheid approach to public space, in which these guards are there to judge the bodies that were submitting themselves for inspection in order to enter the shopping mall, who would probably be searched on the way out as well. So the tradition of the marketplace as the mixing place for everyone is broken in these spaces. I also found an expected long-lost history of stone monuments that the cultures that built them were long gone, and thus rendering them suitable objects of preservation practice. But what I didn't expect is the living cultural traditions of the palace that I found to be a fascinating topic of research. The history of several centuries appears to be alive and living in the present without interruption, even as these cultures have adapted to modern practices. Now, the power of academia to have control over the spaces that people inhabit was demonstrated to me immediately by my friends at the local university who, being hired by the Indonesian Minister of Tourism to enact a preservation project at the palace. And of course, the best example of that would be colonial Williamsburg in the United States. And so in my first month of arriving in Java, I was introduced to this team, and they were quite interested in my views as an American architect. Well, the first thing I said was, this is completely inappropriate to crucify or kill off the royal family, the religious practices enacted in these buildings, in order to resurrect them as a living museum. It was completely inappropriate. And this started me on the journey of understanding how the living culture and how continuous cultural formation is enacted by bodies in space. And that space itself is a structure that is activated by humans operating within it, and very much an instrument of power in one direction or the other. And so the hybrid cultural formation that transforms this Dutch Baroque carriage into Kiai Garuda Kencono, the sacred object of the king of Java, used in weekly rituals to create a balance between heaven and earth to ensure the appropriate flow from heaven to Java. The hybridization of the Baroque architecture, the Middle Eastern fez, the brass band, the Dutch tailscoat that was snipped so that the Javanese sword could be fit in the sarong. All of these are deemed authentically Javanese cultural expressions at the conclusion of a process of cultural syncretization, that it was recast as a Javanese cultural artifact. The Hindu architecture was adapted to become the Islamic architecture, and in the palace, the Hindu symbols of male and female linga and yoni are brought to the mosque to commemorate Muhammad's ascension, paraded through the palace, where the palace itself is a wooden structure, not that grandiose, but the cultural religious significance is still very important. And the people of Java still believe that pieces of these offerings are very much a part of what will help their fields prosper. The structure of the palace is a model of the Hindu Javanese cosmology, and as such it is an instrument for maintaining the balance between heaven and earth. When this pavilion is washed, the women scramble and compete for the runoff water. They collect it in jugs and spread it on their children's bodies when sickness threatens them. Elaine Scarry wrote a book, The Body in Pain, where she locates the human body as the point of origin of all human rights and thus political power. And so the movement of the bodies in space through the framing structure of the palace is very much a part of how hybrid cultural formations occur, either through religious practice or in the service of political power. This is the Javanese New Year's ceremony, in which certain objects are paraded in the dictated direction around the palace to ensure good fortune. And so I was in a position to help develop an alternative conservation plan based more on the Issei Shrine in Japan than on anything else, locating the value in the sense of Alois Riegel's advice on locating value before you attempt to do anything with cultural heritage. The value lies in the body of the king himself, the center of the Javanese religion. And the usage of the bodies in space are very much a part of reinforcing meanings within this context. And so when we went to work with funding from the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, we performed all the rituals required by the Javanese custom. The priest carpenter who did the work was the head of everything, and the palace muddles through today through very strange, sometimes awkward juxtapositions of different meanings of modernity, of tradition, various religions, but it is constantly reinforced and renewed through these ritual cycles of bodies in space, including the contended succession of kingship after the death of the last king. And so the ancient rituals are constantly renewed. And I want to briefly touch on a few other examples. One is work in Sumatra after the 2004 tsunami. We were offered a position in the local university, air conditioning, AutoCAD computers, but instead we located our activities in the village where a temporary structure had been built, where 85% of the population of the village had perished in this. The engineers from Australia told us we must prevent people from rebuilding their houses because they will not do it properly according to proper technical seismic engineering principles. And our response was to partner together to create a comic book that would empower people, re-empower people to build their own houses. The next example is in Medellin, Colombia, where the drug cartels created the most massive murder rate in human history. In Medellin, they'd made a corpse map locating the bodies of those killed in the drug wars. And wherever the most bodies were found, as in this location, that's where they would invest the most money. And they built a state-of-the-art library, park, and mass transit system to link this community to the rest of the economic system, transforming the community, leaving the houses just as they are. And the true test are these bodies in space, the children. And then finally, just to bring it all back to New York, the collaborations of choreographers and architects to understand how cities operate as frames for bodies in space. The Italian futurists, Hitler understood the importance of ritual in highly architecturalized spaces, as did this man returning home from his shopping in China. The body in space is an extremely powerful thing. As a matter of fact, as Elaine Scarry would point out, it is the source of all power. All power over us is through the fear of the body, and all power that we might have over others also involves occupying space, as in the Occupy movement or the Arab Spring. And I would say, moving from these highly rarefied occupations of bodies in space, there is an everyday, the common, as in the day-to-day necessity of occupying space, in which there is a subconscious, sometimes unfortunately conscious struggle between those who have a fear of the crowd and are driven to occupy their private spaces as mobile pieces of architecture of steel and glass on rubber wheels, and how it displaces the bodies of others. And the photographs of Martin Romer's are wonderful documentations of specifically this phenomenon that is not just in Asian cities but throughout the world, of the contestation of bodies in space in the city. And finally, this video of what academics can do. In New York City, not far from here, the academics are moving their slideshows to the sides of buildings. And their collaborators are not co-authors who already have tenure, but the people who are engaged in struggles on the street. And theories are being tested against actual consequences on the ground, on the streets, with their collaborators, thus being verified by people without tenure, the occupants of the streets themselves. Thank you very much.
I have 102 thoughts, of course, but the one thing that you reminded me again in talking about bodies in space was the information that is encoded in trained bodies. That is, you know, when rituals are performed or choreographers perform, there is a sort of information about space and building and daily life and interaction that's encoded because of that training. It's there in your body because you have learnt that body. And that kind of information exists, as you reminded us as well, in our everyday life of learning to navigate cities because you know that city, and knowing then when you move somewhere else that you're matter out of place. And it's maybe more, it's actually distinct. I mean, for me, even moving from, at one point from Bombay and visiting LA, I mean, New York was sort of familiar, but LA, I really felt disjunct. It's sort of like you don't know how your body, and you realize it is a trained, even if it's a kind of daily ad hoc training and not a dancerly training, it is a trained body, and it's a body trained to inhabit that kind of space. And starting from that premise as a way of understanding cities is I guess I'm just re-echoing, reminds me how important that is and where it places one's attention.
Well, I think the key word is reflex, that it's precognitive. It may take the form of information at some point, but that's not its primary characteristic. It is a conditioned response. And conditioned responses are things that happen naturally, as when the doctor hits your knee. Well, that's a biological mechanism, a physiological mechanism. But there are conditioned responses that, you know, when our dog behaves, he gets a treat. When he misbehaves, he gets a smack on the nose. That's a conditioned response. But then there are designed responses. There are designed reflexes. And we design systems, and we design spaces, and we design behaviors. We design the outcomes of our systems that are supposed to operate without conscious engagement. And these are, to a degree, interesting in that they seem to be the most powerful operations occurring in space, far more important than vision and cognitive communication of meanings. And I think that there's a tradition of the fox and the hyena and the wily, you know, opportunistic. And when I'm referring to our conversation last week on the phone, when someone moves to New York, they either develop a way of walking that conveys immediately, even if subconsciously, I'm comfortable here, I belong here, don't bother me. Or they don't develop those reflexes, and the consequences are something that many of us know, that you become the target of crime just by the way you walk, and which is precognitive. You can tell people, don't look anyone in the eye, but it is fundamentally not a conscious thing. You just simply become familiar with the streets. You become familiar, you quickly acclimatize and habituate to the surroundings and the cultural context and the social norms of a place. And I think your work, just to turn it back to you, of the life and death, not just getting robbed or not getting robbed, but the life and death status of clothing, language, gestures, body language, where you get off, how you greet people. I think that is something that is very much pushing me to emphasize these things. So that aspect of your work.
Well, then I have to come back to yours, because we're talking earlier about sort of preservation and issues of preservation and so on. And so I was interested in the fact that you had done a certain kind of preservation or conservation project in Indonesia, and or trying to recover.
Not by choice.
No, I understand. But but I guess I'm thinking, when we're not talking about preserving buildings, or we're not talking about preserving, in a sense, a certain kind of built space, but we're talking about preserving what's inside, as in the ways in which people inhabit those spaces. Maybe it's not even a question of preservation, but when we're using the body as a way to figure out what a history or a legacy, and just trying to link it to some of the earlier conversations we had, when you're finding the codes or the encodedness in something that is already very lived, rich, and changing, and continually changing, it places the questions of preservation in a much more mobile, or conservation in a much more mobile space, right? I mean, even I was thinking, Brian and I have been involved in a project called Living Arts City, but it's like a project which is very much about live arts, which have strong tradition but are continually moving. Similarly, ways of inhabiting space that I have to learn how to move in New York, but it is also a continually changing environment, and there's a kind of adaptation. That you're looking at notions of legacy, received information, but in a very mobile, embodied form, which just seems to me to turn the questions of conservation on their head in an interesting and a productive way.
Well, conservation should be recognized as the flip side of the coin of modernization. That when you create a rupture with everything in the past and say everything from this point onward will be new, that necessitates conservation as a counteracting movement. In the 21st century, the rupture has softened. The sense of necessity of the rupture has softened, I should say. And thus the role of conservation is liberated from that pickle it at that moment in time, freeze it on the other side of the rupture, and don't let anyone touch it. It is much more about the present moment and where is meaning, what meanings and what vehicles of meaning are worthy of special treatment, to keep those things alive in the present and in the future. So really the location of value is and has always been in the present. And 100 years ago, Alois Riegel articulated this brilliantly in his conservation principles of locating value, and you don't treat every artifact the same. You locate it, you treat it in a way that is specifically linked to what is important, what is valuable. Otherwise, you run the risk of killing the value in order to bring it back to life with a misplaced approach to conservation.
Just wanted to interject one point about the bodies, and I apologize if this was mentioned before I had to step out, but the fact that they are dressed bodies, and Robert, obviously you've referenced that, but just like to sort of bring clothing into the conversation. And clothing tends to be also called fashion, and if it's called fashion, it often, and this is slightly preempting Christina's paper, I know, but it's often kind of seen as something very frivolous. But I think the role of clothing on these bodies, and really referencing, I think, Radhika, your point about how to dress and how to be in a new place, is also how not just how to look, but how to feel comfortable in one's dress body. So I just wanted to really refer to something you mentioned, Robert, but I think is hugely significant in these conversations too.
Actually, the papers to which Robert referred, they were written very much in the context of a certain polarized moment in Bombay, where what you were wearing and how you could pass was a very significant element. So clothing is important. But also to draw on Robert's idea of habitus, which Bourdieu chose, it's always been interesting to me that habit, is not just everyday habit, but habit is about the dressed self, and that feeling, inhabiting place is as much about living in it as about feeling a sense of comfort. I mean, we talked a lot about old coats, and that is a very significant part of what it means to live. This is the first, in a sense, house that you live in, right, before we move out.
Just one more thing. It's often quite interesting when one talks to people in surveys, etc., about feeling comfort in their clothes. It's one instantly thinks, oh, this refers to kind of soft, nurturing clothes, but actually it's usually just that sense of being in the right things in the right place at the right time, which is very interesting.
This connects to the research I've done on the city of Jakarta, which for many years during the colonial period was ruled by an apartheid policy. Instead of pass cards that indicated your identity, it was encoded in the clothing and in the vehicles. So there were laws called the sumptuary codes that dictated who could wear what signals of status, who could ride in a carriage, how many horses the carriage could be, who could be carried in a palanquin, how many buttons, whether the shoe buckle was pewter or brass. Every detail of clothing was an indicator of status and would gain you access through one doorway or restrict your access. So it's quite interesting to see the shopping mall guards at the doorway and the driving, the unwritten traffic laws, the enacted social understandings in Jakarta. When two cars come to an intersection at the same time, there is an instantaneous recognition of the value of the vehicle, and the lesser valued vehicle yields to the higher valued vehicle, and this dictates the automobile purchase choices of people throughout society. So it's interesting to see how the sumptuary codes have been moved from a formal governmental arrangement to an informal arrangement, but it's still just as active as ever, one would argue.
And it ties into the colonial conversation because, and I don't know if it's the same in Indonesia and the self-colonizing of Thailand, the sumptuary codes were changed to enforce Western-style clothing in order to project the civilized image of the new country to the world.
Hi, thank you. So I'm trying to get a handle on these cultural constructions, and I'm a student here, and I guess I'm wondering, I see some threads running between both of you of, so I'm wondering what as a researcher, as a current being trained to be a researcher, I'll be a future researcher in the city or practitioner in the city, what is this role of research? What is this role in tracing these cultural connections, right? They're living, they're always changing, they're always in flux, so I can't get a handle on it? Or is there another, like, how do my methods shift? Because I know you mentioned, we're going in and we can do research, but we're not going to do it in the university. We're going to do it somewhere else, right? We're going to do it in a different location. Or speaking of Bordeaux and some of his methods, or like what are some of the methods of tracing these cultural connections? I mean, do they change? Can we just kind of do the same old thing of thinking about cities, or do we have to have some kind of a shift at all?
I think at the core, that's a great question. I think at the core of everything is being conscious of where authority is located. Traditionally, in the 20th century, we developed a pretense. We developed a scientific attitude that, what do you mean? This is not about power, this is scientific, this is objective, this is neutral. But of course, that is not true. It has never been true. And anthropology seems to have a healthier awareness of this because it went through a crisis because of its role during colonialism. It was a tool and instrument of colonialism, and it was in the midst of collapse 50 years ago in the post-independence period, and had to rebuild itself from scratch to a large extent. And it did so by saying, listen, partly through the work of Pierre Bourdieu, these things are located and they are informed by power, and we simply have to be conscious of where power is located. What are the mechanisms of power? Capitalism seems quite comfortable with this, and fascism seems quite comfortable with this. So why is it that we disarm ourselves by pretending that this is neutral and that we have no business? And the advice of Bourdieu's collaborator, Louis Wauquin, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name, is participant, observer, all right. But let's acknowledge that these subjects are thinking and acting agents. They have agency. He recommends the observer participant, that everyone engaged in these rituals in space on the ground are conscious political beings. They are embodied with power. They are subjected by power structures. And this divide between academia and people in space and bodies is a false construct. And that's the important thing to get over.
Maybe just to add to that, the other thing is to remember in what form your research is speaking to the world, right? Because one of the things you ended with were the projections on the side of the building, and I do a lot of work around curatorial practice, around creative strategies in cities, public art. So part of what you're thinking about is the form, is the representation of the thing. That it's not that I have a body of research and then I produce a monograph completely, as if that's a default position, right? So that's one of the things I feel that artistic practices, which are continually asking you what it means to photograph while taking architectural photograph while keeping the people front and center. That in itself is a complete shift in the way you see.
Brilliant presentations. So you referred to Regal, which I thought was very interesting, very appropriate sort of reference point. And when Regal was writing about his value systems, he was certainly looking at Western constructs, both people and cities. And if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think he had 3 value systems. He had use value, age value, and if I remember correctly, historic value. His basic argument was there are certain entities that you preserve purely for use. As long as it's useful, you're fine. That's conservation. Then he said there are certain which are much more intellectual. So it's age value, it's the patina that's more important than the use. And then the third was societal. So it was the meanings that society attributes to them. So it's not about use, it's not about age, it's about the perception of society. So I wondered, what struck me is, as you've delved so brilliantly into sort of non-Western, constructs, much more complex than the sort of pure Eurocentric cities, that European cities that he was looking at, have you collided with other value systems that might expand that and give us sort of tools to take this further?
I'll have to turn to you because Regal, I'm not intimate with Regal, so I haven't, but I'll think about it as you.
Well, Regal said that when the Romans built this column, it was a celebration of the triumph against the Trojans, etc. Commemoration of the spoils of war. The Arch of Triumph was actually constructed from the spoils of war. It was a scaffolding that was simply festooned with the riches that were brought back from the conquered territories. And the historic value that was intended by the Arch of Triumph was eternal. And so the intention was that this arch be continuously renewed and never exhibit a patina of age. And yet we do not value these arches, we don't even know about these things, and yet we still value these arches. We protect them and preserve them, and why do we do that? It's because the physical artifact and the meanings associated with those artifacts exhibits or experiences slippage, that new meanings come in and old meanings are displaced. And this can happen in a top-down way that is imposed by colonial power or by governments that impose clothing on bodies or on buildings. And I think all of the countries we've looked at, there have been rules that said, make a modern building, but you have to put a roof on it that connects it to the national identity. And so these things occur constantly. These same operations, these cultural constructs, these constructions of meaning as instruments of identity construction should be available not just to governments. They should be available to groups, communities that are engaged in the construction of identity, and they should be re-empowered to construct identity through these instruments and these vehicles, and not simply sit back and wait for identity construction to occur at them or to them. And so that's kind of a shifting, a recognition that is important, because academics are the first ones to disempower ourselves. We're just neutral observers. We don't have anything to do with this. We'll write about it when there's a safe distance of 20 years and it's safe to write about it. That is not, it's a crucial thing to do, but it's not essential for everyone to wait 20 years. It's not essential to take an attitude that this has nothing to do with me, and I have no role in how it plays out in real time. It's actually something that Hitler used quite effectively. He was, in some ways, the most important designer of the 20th century, inventing the highway system, designing the Beetle, the costume, the flag. It was a design process. It was a cultural construction. Other people should have access to that, not just fascist dictators, not just colonial powers, not just nationalist governments, others.
Are we at time? Thank you, Robert.
Okay, thank you.